Hello everyone. This is going to be a response video to my own video on the Homestuck 7 analysis. First of all, I just want to thank everyone who has watched that video and made it so popular, as well as everyone who's been participating in the conversation down in the comments. But today, I encountered a new theory. A theory that in many ways validates some of the things I said in that video, but in other ways completely and totally changes not just how I am viewing Act 7, but also how I am viewing Homestuck as a whole. So, like the previous two videos, there's not going to be much in the way of editing for this video. I apologize, I'm still in a lot of pain. I'm actually doing really poorly today, but I wanted to get this up right away and point this out to everyone. This theory originates from Homestuck fan Wakraya, also known as Seer of Doom. I've gotten her permission to go ahead and make a video about this theory. I'm not going to go ahead and read the entire theory. This is not just going to be a reading post. There is a audio recording that you can find for those of you who have trouble with reading online. But I just want to cover and highlight a few points. But basically, the first point I want to make is just a point of my own. So, if you're a fan of Undertale, you might know that one of the meta-narratives that takes place in Undertale is that the game challenges you to not view the characters as lines of code and dialogue, but actually see the characters as something more than that, something real. Now, what would be the odds that Toby Fox, composer for Homestuck, a man who by his own admission produced quite a bit of Undertale while living in Andrew Hussy's basement, might have incorporated some themes or some ideas that he'd talked to Andrew about. And I mean, think about it, we can even see it in our own community. How many of us take ownership of these characters? How many of us see these characters as something living and breathing? I mean, yes, they're very well-written characters. Because of the dialogue-heavy nature of Homestuck, it's very easy to see these characters as something more than just words on a page. And we get to see their actual thoughts. We get to see their personalities very clearly spoken. If we take ownership of these characters, and me as an older Homestuck, I tend to kind of empathize with the dads. And, you know, if I do role-playing, I often will role-play as like a Dad Crocker or a Dad Egbert. And that one comic that's been going around where Dad Crocker is just like, I'm going to adopt all of you. That's me. That is, you know, if I had my ways, I would make sure that these characters are safe and happy for the rest of their days. So if that is the case, if we want these characters to be happy, why aren't we happy with the ending? I mean, we're watching the ending, and we're constantly expecting something bad to happen. And we're constantly expecting that something more has to happen. But haven't these characters been through enough? I mean, after 6 acts, and all of the sub acts that exist within Act 6.
Why you keep trying? You done.
After that much time, don't these characters deserve to be happy? Well, what about the 3-act structure? Well, what about it? I mean, just putting aside whether or not a 3-act structure is actually important to all forms of storytelling, why do we need to see additional climax and resolution when we have an ending that has basically given these characters everything they could possibly want? Well, what about character arcs? Well, we've already seen these characters do quite a bit of growth and development throughout the comic. You know, don't these characters now deserve to grow and development on their own outside of this crazy, deadly game that has treated them so harshly and awfully? And that's kind of where this theory goes. This theory looks at Homestuck not as just a webcomic, not just as a story about characters in this creation myth, but about characters who are existing in a narrative, breaking free from the confines of that narrative. And once you start to look at the comic in that terms, as a story of people trapped in a narrative who are desperately trying to break out of it, things start to make a lot more sense, and all of a sudden, the ending starts to make so much more sense. Now again, I'm not going to read the whole theory here, but basically some of the highlights of it are, in a way, the ending feels like we've just skipped to the good ending. Like we either used a cheat code or a walkthrough and ignored all of the neutral route that we would have normally seen and just got the good ending right away on the first try. So, in a way, that's kind of what happens. The kids have Earth, and Juju Vriska manages to flip the ending so that instead of being trapped by Paradox Space's rules, they manage to end the game properly and get their happy ever after. So, they go on to talk about character arcs. Now, one of the biggest complaints is that the character arcs feel shortened and cheated by Game Over. We have all of this character development that took place for the beta kids. Now, Act 6's character development for the alpha kids is not really all that affected by Game Over. They're not on the meteor. They continue to progress the way they did, with all of their craziness and zaniness and all of the drama that they had to deal with. But the beta kids, they get all of this character development, all of this dynamic growth, and then it just all gets retconned away. Game Over happens, and then John saves Vriska's life, and we get a completely different meteor ride that is much calmer and happier. So was all that character development pointless? Where are the arcs that replace it? Well, I just want to think about, again, going back to the idea of looking at these characters not as just characters in a story, but as actual people you're supposed to care about. Do you really want to see these character arcs? Do you really want Rose to have to struggle with alcoholism? Do you really want to see Terezi stuck in an abusive relationship? No, of course you wouldn't. So, The retcon fixes everything, and then all of those horrible things seem to go away. And then we get even additional bonuses from it. You know, Dave becomes a lot more happier and open individual. Carcat becomes a happier, more open individual. He no longer feels himself tied down to this leadership role where all he can do is feel the guilt of his failures. And Gamzee, this, omnipresent threat, is completely and totally neutralized. Now people are like, well, that robs Gamzee of any growth and development. But we kind of see that, Gamzee doesn't really grow or develop. He just becomes more and more of a threat the more he's allowed to have free reign. But the big thing about character arcs is that the story itself completely and totally rebuffs the idea. Now, this has been pointed out in arguments about character arcs before. I'm going to go ahead and reread it here for those of you who have not or do not remember this scene. No, this isn't like that. Trust me, Dave, I am not grasping at straws here. My abilities tend not to leave such things to speculation. This development makes absolutely no sense. Not for us as a group, and definitely not for me personally, or her for that matter. How could this possibly mean anything for my growth or personal development in any way? This almost makes it official. I have no comprehensible path. There is nothing to overcome, no lesson to learn, no cathartic light at the end of this preposterous tunnel, not for me at least. I seriously have the dumbest arc anyone could conceivably imagine. Rose, we don't have fucking arcs. We are just human beings. Rose, we don't have fucking arcs. We're just human beings. Hussey he's directly coming out and challenging you to not think of the characters in this term. So now, speaking of Hussey, we have Andrew Hussey, the writer of Homestuck. And he self-inserts into the comic. And the first time it happens, it's just kind of a bit of a joke. And even he points out, like, oh, no. This is never a good idea. This never works. So most of us probably thought that, we shouldn't take anything that Hussey does in this comic seriously. It's a joke, right? That's all it amounts to. But look at what Hussey does. He's the one who brings Spade Slick back into the comic. He's the one that brings the ring that allows Calliope to come back to life, that allows Arania to destroy the Game Over timeline. He's the one who defeats Doc Scratch. He's the one who delays Vriska from using the Juju. He is a real active force in the comic. And again, he is not a character. He is not just some, self-insert character that the author is doing for jokes or for laughs or for prestige, for his own amusement. He is the author. He narrates. He describes things. He affects the outcome. This is Andrew Hussey in the Homestuck universe. And then we have the Jujus. Speaking of that ring. A ring that literally lets a character come back to life beyond any narrative means. We've got the lollipop that Caliborn and Calliope gave to Jane. An artifact that literally takes the story and shortcuts it to a point where the Alpha Kids are fully geared, they're in a position where they can resolve their differences, and they are exactly where they need to be for the plot to develop. We have the crowbar, an item that Caliborn literally uses to break the website. He literally hits a console with the crowbar, and the MS Paint Adventures website that you are reading, not the one that is displaying the Midnight Crew or Homestuck in any of the other areas. No, 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 no. It is literally the website you're reading starts to break and shake and fall to pieces. And then, of course, we have the house. John sticks his hand in the house juju, and he gains the ability to go to any point in the timeline. But this is not any normal time travel. This doesn't follow any of the rules that Homestuck has established for how time travel works. No. This is time travel that is perfect time travel. Time travel where whatever you do, whatever changes you make, become the actual changes to the timeline. This is time travel so potent that the fans literally referred to it as the retcon power. I mean, that's basically what John does. Game over happens, and he retcons it. He retcons Vriska's death, makes it so that she manages to survive, and then the game over timeline never happens. However, paradoxically, and again, it doesn't matter because of the way his power works, there are characters from the game over timeline that survive. That's how perfect his retcon powers is. He needs Roxy to be alive. He wants Roxy to be alive. Roxy gets to come along. I mean, how can you imagine an artifact like that in any narrative? Seriously, I want you to stop and think for a second. What sane author would put these narrative items into their story? What sane author would literally give someone the ability to completely rewrite time in their story? What would sane author would literally give someone an item that, imagine if you're reading a book, they start swinging the item in the book, and all of a sudden the words start falling off the page? What sane author would literally say, oh, here's this item, and now the characters are from this transitional period to having everything resolved? No one would do that. Items like that can't exist in a normal story. They can't exist in a 3-act structure. But in a story where you're supposed to be aware of the narrative, in a story where the characters themselves are meant to interact directly with the narrative, all of a sudden, these items begin to make sense. Let's talk briefly about Cascade. Acts 1 through 5 of Homestuck are what many people consider to be the height of Homestuck. You start out with Act 1 when, the fans had a heavy influence on Homestuck, and it kind of meanders, and it's full of programming jokes, and it's filled with lots of jokes that are inspired by old school and retro video gaming. And then you progress to Act 2, and you start seeing that there's more of a narrative. And just from that point on, it just builds and builds and builds until we get to Act 5. And then the narrative reaches the height where most of the fandom joined on and hopped on board. They saw the trolls, they heard all of these interesting things about the troll romances, they heard all of these interesting things about their plots and character arcs in the story. And you get some of the most amazing moments in Homestuck. You get Seer Descend, you get Awake, you get Rose, you get Jade Enter, and then it all culminates in Cascade, one of the most impressive feats of visual storytelling I have ever seen. We are talking about a single flash animation that is less than 15 minutes long that contains only 2 lines of dialogue that I think are a total of 5 words. And then they wrap up every single plot line that has been set up. And I mean, I still to this day, Cascade leaves me in awe. I mean, how can you not call that the high point of this comic? But what happens shortly after Cascade, when we get into Act 6? Lord English comes into the comic, and he kills Hussey. The author dies. If the author is dead, if English and Caliborn are now exerting such force over the comic, doesn't it make sense that Act 6 would start to get a little crazy? And I mean, look at the act structure for Act 6. I mean, seriously, after a point, who here was not expecting Act 6 to literally end on Act 6, Act 6, Act 6, 666? Who here wasn't expecting that after a certain point? The meandering way, the way the acts constantly expand out, the way position the perspective shifts so crazy, the existence of Homestuck, it all makes sense when you consider the fact that Hussey, the author, is dead and can no longer exert full influence in the story. He is no longer the omnipotent, omniscient narrator. And Caliborn even brings this up. And I mean, Caliborn interacts with Hussey. He forces Hussey to change points of the narrative. He's not the only one either. I mean, remember, before Collide, there's that scene where Spade Slick literally has a cybernetic eye that he shouldn't have. The narration literally is like, wait, that's just a plastic eye. How is this acting like a cybernetic? You've got Vriska, who, in the middle of opening the Juju, Husky tries to cut away to a different perspective to show what Casey is doing in raising her skeleton army, and Vriska literally tears the perspective back under her control. And then from that point on, acknowledges the narrative and continues to interact directly with it and directly with Hussey. This, I think, above all else, shows just how much this narrative is meant to be influenced by the characters. So finally, we have the Juju and John's retcon powers. What did they actually do? What was the actual effect of the power? It allowed the characters to finally realize themselves beyond a part of a narrative. By giving John that much power and by allowing him to extend it to the will and influence of his friends and via Terezi and Vriska and everyone kind of like helping out and chipping in. By doing all that, it allowed all of the characters to start grasping their own free will away from the author. They became the ones who started to be in control of the narrative. They got to do what they wanted to do. And what is it that they wanted to do? They wanted their happy ending. They wanted to bring Earth back. They wanted to repopulate it. They wanted to have all of their friends alive and happy on this planet. And that's what we see. That's the ending we are given. And as for Vriska and Lord English, well, Lord English, through the creation of the narrative, and being its driving force and constantly trying to pull the narrative to himself, through all of that selfish action, is literally trapping himself in the narrative. Vriska, through insisting that she becomes the main character, that she be the ones in control, is literally trapping herself in the narrative. Look at what side of the juju they are on together when Vriska deploys it. They are both on the same side. They are both on the side that is going to be trapping, the would originally trap the four heroes that would be able to then trap other people, supposedly, inside it. They are literally, through their own arrogance and their own desire to make the narrative so important and so about them, trapped in it. And similarly, the same thing happens to the ghosts. What is it that Mina wants? What is it that the original dead Vriska wanted? They want relevance. They want to be important in the narrative again. That's what Arania wanted. That ended up in her own destruction. Because they are so focused on being a part of the narrative, they are stuck within it. But the kids don't care. All the kids want is to be able to move on with their lives. And that's what they get. That is the ending they get. And it is the ending they deserved. Again, I highly recommend that you go through and read this entire theory. Like I said, it explains it much better than I possibly could. But I just wanted to cover and show just how well I believe this theory explains everything that happened in Homestuck up through Act 7 compared to a lot of the things that I had come up with. Because once you start seeing Homestuck as a meta-narrative about 8 kids who are literally attaining self-awareness from the narrative that they are trapped in, the entire comic starts to make a lot more sense. So I've got to thank Seer of Doom for letting me post this theory. Again, I'm going to link to this theory. I highly recommend you read it. It'll be in the description below. And I would like to thank all of you who made it this far in the video, all of you who watched my previous Act 7 analysis. It's been a ride, and I can't wait for the ride to continue. As much as I just said, that we should be seeing these kids as characters, I can't wait for the epilogue. I will, of course, cover the epilogue as soon as it comes out. And, of course, once that happens, we'll see how much of this is right, how much of this was wrong. Until then, thank you all again. This has been Divine Erdrick, signing off.